As I said back in my Final Fantasy II review, Final Fantasy II is bad. If you haven't seen that review, well, what are you doing here? Go watch that one first. Anyway, Final Fantasy II was bad, but I clearly wasn't the only person who thought that way. While the game did sell more than its predecessor in Japan, the gaming public at large seems to have made it one of the franchise's black sheep. But to be fair, Final Fantasy II was just one of several games to succumb to what I have dubbed Famicom sequel syndrome. Basically, if a franchise starts out on the Famicom, the second game will be different from the first, and this will, in turn, cause it to either not sell as well, or not get as much positive reception. Or both. There are plenty of franchises that had this happen to them. Mario, Zelda, Castlevania, Fire Emblem over in Japan, and Metroid and Kid Icarus still sort of fall under this category, even though their sequels were on the Game Boy. The only franchises that didn't seem to fall in line with this were Mega Man and Ninja Gaiden. However, as bad as this can seem, the game right afterwards is not only one that's more reminiscent of the first game than it is the second, but said game is also considered in the running for best in the franchise, even if it wasn't on the Famicom. Super Mario Bros. 3 is often considered the best 2D platformer in the series besides Super Mario World. Super Metroid is often considered the best in the franchise, with the only other competition being Metroid Prime. Zelda: A Link to the Past is often considered to be the best 2D entry, with some even considering it better than Ocarina of Time, which gets touted by some as the best game ever made. And even though it's not considered as great as Super Castlevania 4 or Symphony of the Night, Castlevania 3 is often considered the best of the NES games, and still is considered a great game to the point that it became the basis for the Netflix series. So, the question here is, would Final Fantasy III join these games as a great moment in history for its franchise, or would it end up another dud? Well, for one, the timing was not exactly the best. Don't get me wrong, it's still much better than what Final Fantasy II got. Final Fantasy III was released on April 27th, 1990, almost a year and a half after Final Fantasy II. This meant that there was still much more time to focus on getting rid of bugs, while also focusing on the game itself. However, this time Final Fantasy III has a very bizarre development history. Lead programmer Nasir Gabelli, and I'm probably butchering that name, who had been the person to program both 1 and 2 onto the Famicom, was working on programming 3 onto the Famicom, but due to an expired work visa, was forced to leave Japan and head back to Sacramento, California, in the middle of development. As such, the development team actually followed Gabelli to America with the necessary equipment, notes, and materials needed in order to finish the game. This means that Final Fantasy III is one of the first, and probably only games, to be developed in a country where it would never be played. But then there's another issue: the year it was released. 1990 was also the year that the Super Famicom, later known as the Super Nintendo in the West, was released. And Square was extremely behind on the technology when they did make Final Fantasy III. In fact, the result of focusing on the Super Famicom hardware meant that Square never had time to release the game in North America. In an interview with Eurogamer in 2007, game designer Hiromichi Tanaka said, "Nowadays, we know that when you've got a platform like PlayStation, you'll have PlayStation 2, and then PlayStation 3, and where you've got Xbox, you move on to Xbox 360. You can sort of assume what's going to happen in the future. But back then, that was the first time that we'd seen a new generation of consoles, and it was really difficult to predict what was going to happen. At that time, then, we were working so hard to catch up on the new technology that we didn't have enough manpower to work on an English version of Final Fantasy III. On top of that, the original Final Fantasy was finally released to North Americans in 1990, which meant Square's localization team would have never had enough time to release either 2 or 3 to North America before the Super Nintendo was out. And North American gamers were abandoning the NES in favor of its successor far quicker than Japanese gamers were, even though the Super Nintendo wasn't released for another 9 months after. Even if they did decide to localize FF3, there's one last snag that stopped it: the memory. Final Fantasy III wouldn't get a remake until 2006, in time for Final Fantasy's 20th anniversary, though not for lack of trying. There were several attempts at remaking the game for other consoles, particularly a handheld console known as the WonderSwan Color. If you've never heard of this thing, Well, there's good reasons for it. Not only did it not get released outside of Japan, but from what I've gathered, it didn't do too well in sales and it died off prematurely. But with how much they crammed into the Famicom version, there wasn't enough time or money for Square to remake the game with updated graphics or music, and that's before deciding to add any new content. Now consider that the Famicom used floppy disks, since it was the family computer after all, and that the NES used cartridges that didn't have as much memory, and the fact that the disc was filled to the brim with content, and you can see why an NES release would have been difficult. Wait. The game is jam-packed with almost everything the Famicom had, and they had 16 months after Final Fantasy II before it was released. This isn't looking good. Well, hope for the best and expect the worst, right? Let's check out the franchise's swan song on the Famicom. So the game begins, once again, with white text on a blue wall explaining what the hell is going on. This time, the game tells us about how tremors are swallowing up the crystals that give light to the world, and that once their light is gone, something will come into the world that has no form, but it's evil and full of dread. But no worries though, because 4 heroes will come and save the world from this evil whatever it is, and everything will be okay. 4 warriors, destined to save the land from an unknown evil that's using natural disasters to drain the light of the crystals? I'm getting a serious sense of deja vu here. Well, if you're getting it too, then guess what? You've caught on to what Square's done! Yes, this game is indeed a back-to-basics game that's sort of a reimagining of the first. We have 4 warriors of light saving the crystals and vanquishing an evil being. Furthermore, just like the first game, none of our characters have predetermined names or personalities. There is some slight backstory to it, but it's nothing major. Our 4 heroes are now these 4 children dressed in adorably small armor. These are the Onion Knights. No, you did not mishear what I called them. They are literally named after a vegetable. Then again, this is the same country where a video game villain would be named after an egg, and who had a princess named after both a fungus and a fruit. Japan is weird. Anyway, these 4 kids in red, blue, green, and red again, real imaginative there, Square, are all nameable. Unlike with the first game, where I had stream viewers be the ones I named the kids after, I actually had the 4 kids named after people I know who I happened to visit last spring. So we have the heroes of Philip and Donald in red, Chris in blue, and Andrew in green. When we start the game, our heroes are falling down a hole. They land in some sort of cave and they need to try to find their way out. By the way, if you're wondering why some of the lines are in quotation marks, that's another cool thing Square did to help with the development of your characters. Since the characters don't have predetermined personalities, you can help make their personalities be whatever you want, and to assist with that, you'll have some of their lines be in quotes. In doing this, it means that any character in the group could be saying this, and it's up to you to determine which character. Anyway, our heroes go through the cave and fight their way out, but I'll talk about combat later. Much later. Deep in the cave, the group finds mysteriously colored water, and one of the Onion Knights decides that they should drink from the water. Instead of being horribly poisoned like you'd think they would, this water actually restores their health and magic. At the end of the cave, the group comes across the first boss, the Land Turtle, and it gets taken out pretty easily. Anyway, afterwards, the group finds a large crystal, which turns out to be the Wind Crystal. The Wind Crystal tells them that its light is dying, and that they are the 4 warriors of light, destined to vanquish the evil and save the land. And so it imbues them with its light as we hear, well, this. Yes, you're hearing that correctly. The main theme of Final Fantasy has returned, and it is once again beautiful. But I'll gush about the music of this game later. Either way, it's a wonderful sound to hear, and I am more than happy to have it return. Afterwards, the crystal provides our heroes with the power of its light. And by its light, I mean job classes. Remember these from the first game? This time, they've improved on it so much! Granted, this was not the first RPG to do a job-based system, and certainly not the first one to do one in this style, but it's the beginning of how the job system would work in the Final Fantasy series. Every character can switch to any job that they have available to them outside of battle, with a character having to spend capacity points in order to switch jobs. Some of you might be thinking, wait, capacity points? I thought that the cost was that your stats got downgraded. And yes, that is how the system works in the DS version. I hate how it's done in the DS version because it discourages party experimentation. With the Famicom version, it's much better. Granted, early on it's a bit of a pain, but there is a workaround to it thanks to something you'll be doing naturally anyway. Leveling. Not just your character's individual levels. As a character starts to use classes more and more, their skill in that class goes up in tandem. And when a class's skill goes up, it becomes cheaper to switch to. You're not as free to switch as you want until later, but it's still a good way to grind levels, skill, and cost points without it feeling forced. As long as you have a good party makeup, you'll do fine. There's also something else that needs to be mentioned with jobs, but I'll go more into detail about that after we get some more. For now, we can have our characters choose between some familiar classes: Warrior, Monk, Red Mage, Black Mage, and White Mage. Yeah, sorry, no Thief, though spoiler alert, we do get the Thief class later. Once we get our new job classes, we can leave the dungeon. If you equip some of the new classes and go back into the dungeon, you'll find a path that leads to several treasure chests. In addition, there are also some hidden areas that we can get into to find more treasure by walking through fake walls. By doing this, we can get some cool equipment for free, like some longswords, some money, and the sleep spell, the first black magic spell available to us. Just be careful not to fall in the hole, or you'll end up having to go through the entire altar cave again. If we head south, we come across the village of where the party is from. One thing I have to note is that the NPCs seem a lot more helpful in this game. Almost all of them are meant to either give you hints about where to go next, or to provide some world building, making them far more helpful than in the last two games. Going into the sanctuary, the boys end up talking to Topapa, their adoptive father and the village elder. He tells them that he understands what happened and says that they have been chosen to take on a great destiny and that he's willing to let them go on their journey. Inside the shrine, we also find two fountains, one that heals the party and restores their magic, and another that revives them completely. Once we head outside and go due north, we find a passageway to a secret storage area, but it's got random encounters. There are also several items that are hidden from plain sight. Inside the storehouse, the NPCs will tell us about how some rooms have secret areas that can be accessed by touching certain items. For example, touching the candle all the way to the right opens up a path to a treasure trove of stuff for us. Sweet! One NPC tells us about the town of Kazas to the south, so that's our next destination. When we go south, however, we find an NPC who we accidentally scare. The NPC tells us that ghosts have infested Kazas. Quick, someone call up Ray Parker Jr.! Actually, it turns out that the ghosts are really just the inhabitants in town that have been cursed into being invisible. And yet we can see the outline of their bodies. Huh. One of the NPCs, named Sid Hayes, and yes, this is a different Sid from the 1 and 2, tells us the location of his airship in the desert to the west, and that we can use it to go and find help. As awesome as it is to get the airship this early, there aren't a lot of places we can go to. Airships in this game can't fly over mountains, so we're stuck in this one little area because there's a boulder blocking the way out. Well, in the meantime, we can head west to Castle Sasane. There, a guard tells us about how the curse has affected the castle as well, and he was able to escape because he was out training. Castle Sasane is another great example of hidden paths, since you can get some goodies including the Tonfa for the monk class, as well as the ice spell. If we head into the throne room, we can talk with the king. He tells us about how the curse was caused by the Jinn, and that the only way to seal him away is to use a mithril ring. Unfortunately, since Kazas is the only place that can make mithril items, we can't get one made. And the only person who possesses such a ring right now is Princess Sarah? Wait, as in the same Princess Sarah from the first game? Wow, they really are going back to basics. The king worries that she may have been kidnapped and taken to the Cave of the Seal, and since there's only one area we haven't explored yet, common sense should tell you where it is. In the meantime, we can get some goodies in the towers behind the main area of the castle, including some arrows, a bow, and the White Slayer, a sword only usable by a red mage. However, said sword is guarded by a griffin. No problem though, we kill it and take the sword, which happens to be holy elemental. We then fly over to the Cave of the Seal. This place is crawling with undead, but fortunately the White Slayer makes quick work of them, as does Cure, which works just like it did against undead in the last game. You know what, while I'm here, let's talk about combat. Combat for the most part hasn't changed much. You still have your options of fight, run, or use an item, however each class has extra abilities as well, which change depending on who you're using. For example, our 3 mages can all cast magic, while the other 3 classes can all defend to lessen damage. As we'll soon see, some classes later in the game have special abilities, but I'll bring those up when it comes to them. One notable change is that the background of the text boxes is now blue instead of black, which I think is a great idea since the menus were always blue as well. In addition, how much damage is done is now displayed via these little red numbers on whoever got attacked, as does HP recovered, but with little green numbers instead. In contrast from its predecessors, when an enemy performs an attack or ability, their sprite flashes for a bit, as well as saying what enemy it was. The rose system returns from FF2, but now it's more usable since the leveling system is back to normal. So mages, you guys stick in the back. Except you, Red Mage, you stay up front in case we need your physical attack. Speaking of mages, this game unfortunately brings back the spell charges system from the first game. Granted, it's a little better in this game since you don't just stop at 9 charges per level, and you're usually never far from a resting place. So it feels more okay to use spells in this game than it did in the first. But one definitely helpful change is that the targeting glitch is gone. Sort of. Remember how when a target died or ran away in the last 2 games and there were characters that still had to attack it, they basically swung at nothing? Well, now they fixed it so that characters move on to another target. Well, if they were using a physical attack. If they were using a spell, they're still locked onto that target. Take what you can get, I guess. Once we're about halfway through the Cave of the Seal, we come across the princess. She says that she intentionally went to the Cave of the Seal in order to try and seal away the djinn, but unfortunately there were too many monsters in the way, so she wants us to stop them. Princess Sarah unfortunately doesn't really do anything. This is one thing I do like about the DS games more than the Famicom. In the DS version, your guest characters could perform one of 2 abilities, including casting spells. Here, they don't do anything. Well, not in combat at least. Pressing the B button, you can actually have guest characters talk to you, and this can be useful for providing some world building or character growth, and can even provide you with some hints on getting through the dungeon. For example, Sarah will sometimes mention that Jin is weak to ice elemental attacks. At the end of the dungeon, we come across the Jin himself. Sarah attempts to use the Mithril Ring, but the Jin doesn't seem affected. The Jin says that he has become so powerful thanks to dark magic that he cannot be affected by the Mithril Ring. And so we fight. Thanks to the Antarctic wind items we got through the dungeon, we kill the Jin in 1 turn. That was easy. Using the Mithril Ring, Princess Sarah seals away the Jin. We then return to Castle Sasane, where the princess throws the ring into a spring and purifies it. Too bad we can't get that ring back. Ah well. With that out of the way, Sarah says that this is goodbye, but sounds reluctant to leave. Talking with the king, we get a canoe, just like we've gotten in the last 2 games. Though it's not nearly as important in this game as it was in the last 2. Well, anyway, we use the canoe to get the airship. We can then travel back to Kazas and finally get mithril weapons and armor, and talk with Sid, who we see is rocking a Papa Smurf beard. He says that he was stuck in Kazas because of a large boulder blocking the path between the mountains to his home of Canaan. However, he believes that the blacksmith in town can build a battering ram to destroy the boulder with. Once the ram's on, we fly over to the boulder and... well, that didn't last long. From here, we have to walk to the town of Canaan. Once there, Sid will go to his house and we can follow him. His wife, named Mrs. Sid for some reason, is incredibly sick. So by pressing B when next to her, we can pull up the inventory and use a potion on her. This will allow Sid to give us access to a secret room full of treasure. We're also told that the only person who would know more about airships than Sid would be King Argus. Meanwhile, in a building next to the inn, there's a young girl who is bedridden who keeps talking about some guy named Desh. Her mother says that Desh ran off for some reason, so we need to go and find him. Well, the only place we can reach is a nearby mountain known as Dragon's Peak. So we travel up the mountain and— oh crap, dragon, run for your life! The dragon, it turns out, is our old friend Bahamut, the guy who upgraded the classes in the first Final Fantasy. Only this time, he's an asshole. You have to run from Bahamut since you can't really beat him, and when you do, you end up in a nest with little baby dragon hatchlings. In the nest itself, we find Desh, but he's suffering from a good old case of RPG amnesia and doesn't know anything about who he is or where he's from, other than that he was supposed to go do something somewhere. Way to be vague, Square. So he decides to tag along with us, just as Bahamut's about to come and eat us. With no other option, we jump out of the nest and land in the middle of a forest area. Desh also gives us the mini-spell, a spell that was in the last game, but it wasn't really one that we needed to worry about. Mini allows the user to shrink down their targets. If used on enemies in this game, it's an instant kill if it can hit. But it's much more useful outside of combat because it allows us to access Tozus, the village of the gnomes. The problem, however, is that whenever a character in any Final Fantasy game is inflicted with the mini status, their physical attacks and defenses are crippled. As a result, until you can get big again, you have to use magic users. This, combined with giving you a Red Mage exclusive item effective against the undead before you go into a dungeon crawling with them, shows that developers tried to push you to use certain classes in certain areas so that you could effectively use any of them at any time. This will become much more obvious later on, too. Moving on, after taking a small detour through Tozus, we finally end up at the Viking Cove. The Vikings, however, are having some problems. The water dragon Nepto has been destroying all of their ships that try to get out of the cove. Without anyone able to go in or out of the cove, the Vikings are running out of supplies. As such, we're told by the head Viking that if we can find a way to calm Nepto down, he'll give us his last ship. But don't go thinking that we can just fight Nepto and be done with it. Trying to fight Nepto will result in a game over unless you've been grinding for a whole week straight or something. Instead, the Vikings hint at heading to the Nepto temple on foot and trying to solve the problem there. Once we get to the temple, we find a dragon statue's head, but it's missing an eye. The mouth of the dragon is open slightly, so if we shrink down using the mini spell, we can maybe squeeze through to find the eye. Unfortunately, once we're inside, we can't grow back, so we have to be mages yet again. Thankfully, this dungeon is mercifully short. There are plenty of side paths if you want to get stuff, but none of the enemies have that high of a magic resist stat. At the end of the dungeon, we find a giant rat that's guarding the eye, so we have to fight it. It goes down pretty easily, and we bring the eye back. Putting the eye in its socket, Nepto speaks to us and apologizes, saying that the darkness had overwhelmed him and made him go crazy. To make up for it, he gives us the Water Fang, but that's not our only prize. Upon returning to the Vikings, we are awarded with their ship, the Enterprise. The group then sails from the cove to Takul, a small town that's in ruins. The villagers are afraid to speak, but one of them mentions that an evil man by the name of Hein attacked them earlier, and that he has repeatedly returned to take more prisoners and kill others. As such, they're worried about helping the group. From there, the group can walk westward across the desert. Floating high above the desert is a large thing. Well, it's not important for now, so let's keep going. Heading further west, we come across the Village of the Ancients. Here, we discover quite a twist. It turns out that the world we've been walking on is not actually the world, but instead a continent, floating above a large ocean. One kid even challenges us to ride around the perimeter of the continent on a chocobo, and he will give us a prize if we do. Fortunately, we can find a chocobo forest nearby. Note that I said a chocobo forest, not the chocobo forest. There are actually several in this game, and they're spread out quite a distance. This solves one of the problems that we had in the last game. Recall that the chocobo forest in that game was south of Cashman Keep, which meant you had to run quite a distance just to get there, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. Here, there's plenty all over the area, and they can be accessed rather easily. Also fixed is the chocobo theme. The song plays as normal when you get on a chocobo, but the song also has a new little addition that plays after the first part loops twice. Now it's sounds familiar. Anyway, by riding the chocobo around, we get an item from the boy in the village. The gnomish bread! Yeah, I should bring this up. See, remember how in the last two games you could just hold B and press select to see the world map? Well, someone at Square must have thought that was overpowered because now you have to either use the gnomish bread item or the sight spell in order to see where you're going. This is rather annoying if you're trying to figure out where the hell you need to go, but it can also be a nice little way to explore and find something new. Plus, the game locks off stronger enemies in different parts of the world map that you can't just accidentally run into. So you don't ever feel like you're punished from exploring around like you were in the last game. Granted, there is one part of the game that will be annoying when it comes to not having a map, but we'll talk about that later. Heading north, we can find the living forest, which is rather redundant since trees, plants, and animals are all considered living things, where the fairies tell us that the eldest tree was uprooted by Hein and made into the base for his castle. That's what that floating thing over the desert that we saw was. Heading further north still, we find Argus Castle, but find that no one is inside. It's completely abandoned, unlike with what happened to Castle Sasane. If we head west, we can find the Gulgans, a group of blind monks that can see the future. They tell us that there have been several earthquakes as of recently that have swallowed up the crystals, and that the floating continent is in danger of falling into the ocean below. The only thing stopping it from doing so is for the Warriors of Light, aka us, to climb the Tower of Owen, since legend states that when a red flame shines at the top of the tower, the man who will alter fate will awaken. As a result, they give us the Toad spell, which is needed to access the tower. They also say that it is there that Desh's destiny will be revealed to him. So, since Desh heard that this is his destiny that will be determined, he suggests that we should totally go check it out. The Tower of Owen is actually pretty straightforward. It's a multi-floored tower with lots of goodies in it, but most of them aren't that out of the way, and each floor is rather small. Just like the Gulgans stated, we need to use the Toad spell in order to enter the tower, but we can thankfully change ourselves back this time. Toad is very similar to Minnie in the fact that it transforms you, and if you're inflicted with the Toad status condition, your physical and magical capabilities are pretty much moot. On the way up, a female voice tells us that we won't even make it to her. One floor even has a sealed off area, and Desh tells us how to find the way through, meaning he's getting his memory back. At the top of the tower, we find Medusa, who says that she plans on destroying the tower in order to make the floating continent fall back into the ocean. However, she also states that she's doing this for someone by the name of Xande. Whoever that is. Anyway, we fight her and she goes down pretty easily. That's actually a common thing with a lot of these bosses. Most of them really aren't that much of a threat, so there's not much to talk about, other than that their designs are actually pretty cool and unique. Medusa here is a wonderful example of that. Anyway, once we beat her, Desh finally gets his whole memory back. He reveals that he is actually an ancient, and that he was put in charge of the Tower of Owen to keep the floating continent, well, floating. So he needs to fix that by jumping into the furnace itself. The group warns him that he'll die if that happens, but Desh says there's no other way. In the meantime, he says that we should talk to the dwarves, as they know about the power of fire, and they would tell us what to do with the fire crystal. So Desh jumps into the furnace, sacrificing himself to save the people on the continent. Farewell, friend. With the tower saved and Desh gone, we can head to the Dwarflands next. But if we sail around the continent, we can find the village of Gishal. In this village are some adorable sheep that make probably the cutest sound in the Famicom library. Aw, that's just adorable. Anyway, it's here that we can get access to two new items, magic keys and Gishal greens. The former won't really be used until later, but the latter can be used in chocobo forests. Using them on the big tree in the center of a chocobo forest will summon forth the Fat Chocobo. This thing is great for two reasons. First, it comes with its own rather fitting Fat Chocobo theme. Secondly, the Fat Chocobo isn't a chocobo you ride on. Instead, it solves another problem from Final Fantasy II, and also a bit from Final Fantasy I. Inventory space. You had very little inventory space in both games, with key items taking up important spots and, in 2's case, only carrying one of each item. Here, your items stack, but there's also a lot more of them, so while you only have 32 inventory spaces still, you can use the Fat Chocobo to store the items that you can't carry. Still, the Fat Chocobo is actually kinda disgusting when you think about it. I mean, this thing swallows any items you give it, so when you get it back, well, there's only 2 ways it can come back out. Yeah, remind me never to give this thing potions to store, because I don't think I want to splash that on me if it's got Choco Vomit on it, or worse. Moving on, when we visit the Dwarven Hollow, they're having their own problems. Apparently, the dwarven treasure known as the Horn of Ice was stolen by someone named Gutsko, who hoped to obtain ultimate power. Gutsko is currently hiding out in the underground lake, which we, once again, need to turn into toads to access. But just like last time, we can turn back once we're actually in the dungeon. The underground cave is pretty long, so trying to travel through it is a bit of a struggle, but the enemies here aren't that bad to fight. Battling through them, we eventually confront Gutsko, who says that he won't let us take the horn from him. Gutsko's not too tough of a fight, so once we beat him, we can leave. However, as we do, there's a strange shadow following us. Returning to the dwarves, they're happy to have their horn back, and so they lower the magical barrier protecting the other Horn of Ice. Once we place the recovered horn down, however, the shadow reveals itself to be Gutsko, who was pretending to be dead so he could steal both horns. He takes the horns and runs off to the Molten Cave, where he plans to steal the power of fire. Naturally, we've got to follow him so he doesn't get it first. The Molten Cave seems like it'd be very much like Mount Gold from the first game, but there are actually some differences. First, not every enemy in this dungeon is fire elemental. In fact, one enemy in the dungeon is actually weak to fire. There are some tough enemies here, physically, but they tend to have weak magic defense as a result. The biggest difference, however, is that despite the name, the lava here is not molten. Hell, it's not even boiling like Mount Golg's. Wading through the lava, at least in the Famicom version, doesn't actually hurt you. Unfortunately, we encounter Gutsko in the Crystal Chamber, but it's too late. Gutsko gains the power of fire, and as a result, he transforms into the monstrous Salamander! This is actually pretty good news, though, as he's even easier to stomp than before. The only difference is that Salamander is the first of the bosses that can actually hit everybody at once with an attack, that being his fire breath. Anyway, once we defeat Salamander, the Fire Crystal bestows upon us 4 new jobs, 2 of which are familiar to us. Our familiar new jobs are the Thief and Knight, while our completely new jobs are the Scholar and the Ranger. These classes are the first ones to show off the new abilities the game gives us. While the Ranger is pretty much just a long-range physical class, which can heal for some reason, though I wouldn't recommend switching the White Mage for the Ranger, the other 3 classes can each use different abilities. The Knight has the natural ability to protect allies that are low on health. You know how whenever your allies are low on health, they'll kneel over as if they're about to faint? Yeah, the Knight will protect those guys, even if he himself is running low on health. Thieves can steal from enemies, which gives you the chance of gaining an item. Though, no gil for some reason. I always found that weird. And Scholars... well, I'll talk about them soon enough. Anyway, we can return to the Dwarven Hollow and actually talk with one of the dwarves to gain access to some items for the classes we just got in their treasury. Following that, we can also buy some items at the Village of the Ancients, such as an elemental arrow set for the Ranger. However, when we re-enter the Dwarven Hollow the first time, an NPC villager tells us that Hein is planning on assaulting Tokul once again, so we have to head back. When we return to Tokul, before we can even step foot inside the city, we're captured by Hein's men and brought into his castle. In our jail cell, we find King Argus and his men, who tell us that Hein was once one of the king's advisors, but then one day he just suddenly turned evil and no one knows why. Huh. I wonder why that sounds familiar. Anyway, Hein took away the king's sword, but he says we can keep it if we find it inside the castle. If we can get out of here, that is. Fortunately, one of the NPCs gives us some mallets, an item that functions like the mini spell, and says we can use them to go into a hole in the corner of the jail cell to try and get out. Unlike the last time we used mini, this time we can transform back to normal size once we're through. The dungeon is pretty bog standard for a dungeon. Enemies, narrow paths, hidden treasure, etc. None of the enemies are that tough, however, so it shouldn't be an issue. Once we get to the end of the dungeon, we find Hein, who says that he will rule this land thanks to the powers of darkness he has been given. Powers that have, for some reason, turned him into a walking, talking skeleton, apparently. But whatever, time to fight! Hein is by far the most annoying boss we've faced. He's not the worst boss in the game, not by a long shot, but he is annoying. You get told this by the fairies in the living forest, but Hein's gimmick is that he has ridiculously high defense, can cast level 3 black magic spells, and absorbs every element thrown at him. The catch, however, is that he is exposed to one element, and that he will change which element he's weak to every 3 turns. This is where the Scholar comes into play. Scholars have the ability to see their opponent's HP, like with the Libra spell, but can also see their enemy's weaknesses. Because of this, you're supposed to use Scholars to see what Hein is weak to, and then smack him with the proper book, weapon, and or spell. This, however, is easier said than done. Since you need to use a whole turn to see what weakness Hein has, this means that you have to be careful which spell you use on him. In addition, since he changes his form every 3 turns, this means that, if Hein goes first, he could end up changing his weakness, and you'll end up giving him health instead of lowering it. This also makes the Arrow spell useless, since Arrow is both air and ice elemental, so he'll absorb the spell even if he's weak to one. So, as a result, you really only get 1 turn to effectively damage him with his weakness. It took roughly 30 turns before I finally killed the spooky scary skeleton, though that might have been because of the party setup I had. Also, if you don't collect all the items before you beat Hein, the items become permanently lost, and this is not the only time this happens in the game. Once Hein is defeated, a voice thanks us, revealing itself to be the eldest tree of the living forest. The tree drops us down in the living forest, where it and the fairies give us the Wind Fang for our troubles. Heading back to Castle Argus, we're able to learn another ability the thief has besides stealing items from enemies. As long as the character shown in the overworld is a thief, you can unlock doors temporarily without the need of a magic key, which is pretty cool, honestly. Speaking with King Argus, he gives us an item known as the Time Gear, and tells us to bring it to Sid and he'll fix up the Enterprise. Heading back to Canaan, and giving Sid the Time Gear, he fixes up the Enterprise to turn it from a regular ship to an airship, allowing us to fly, though only allowing us to land in deep water. With this, we can now fly the airship off of the floating continent, only to find that the world has been completely flooded, with no signs of friendly life anywhere. This is the second overworld, which we can't truly unlock until we complete another mission, though this is where an easy and free way to see the map could really be helpful. Because this overworld is almost completely covered in water, trying to find where you are in relation to anything is practically impossible. Thankfully, being in the air like this means you won't have any random encounters. So, while you'll likely be lost, you will still eventually find your way to somewhere. The group comes across the Temple of Water, where they find several crystal shards. But the shards say that only someone named Arya can touch them. Heading north, the group discovers a shipwreck, and inside, a man tells them that the entire world is flooded, and that the only survivors he knows of are him and an injured woman sleeping in the bed in the room behind him. Giving the woman a potion, she reveals herself to be Arya, the Maiden of Water. Arya recognizes the group as the 4 Warriors of Light, and insists that they take her with them to the Temple of Water, as she's the only person who can help them break the curse on the flooded world. Once we go to the temple, Arya grabs the crystal shards and takes us to the nearby Cave of Tides. The Cave of Tides is a rather dangerous dungeon, as there are several enemies here that can inflict status conditions on the group. Fortunately, the Knight class makes pretty quick work of them, as does using the lightning and fire elements. Once we get to the crystal chamber in the temple, Arya prays to the shard, when suddenly, a monster appears! Arya pushes our heroes out of the way as the monster shoots an arrow, which pierces into Arya. The monster reveals that it, much like Medusa, is working for the mysterious and evil Xande, and attacks us, revealing itself to be Kraken! Oh hey Kraken, nice to see you again! Though Kraken isn't the feet of water again, he has taken a level in elemental resistance, as he is no longer weak to lightning. However, he forgot to take some levels in durability, since he goes down without much of a problem. We kill Kraken, but Arya's wound is fatal. Before she dies, however, Arya passes on the power of the water crystal to us, giving us several new job classes. Before we can do anything, however, an earthquake hits. The heroes feel like they need to leave, though at least one of them doesn't want this cave to be Arya's burial place. A rock falls and hits the heroes on their heads, knocking them out as the water in the flooded world recedes. Well, since we're here, and in honor of Arya's death and her beautiful theme song, I'm going to finally talk about the music and how wonderful it is. Once again, Nobuo Uematsu shows how freaking amazing he is as a composer. This time, he's done his biggest job yet in the series. Final Fantasy III contains 43 songs, which is one more song than both 1 and 2's soundtracks combined. There are themes for every situation in the game, and though there are some situations which share songs, they're done in a way that makes them seem important. For example, whenever you're in a dungeon that has a crystal in it, or whenever you're in an area suffering from an issue. As well as when you're in an area who just had that issue resolved. But some areas have their own theme songs in them, different from most of the rest of the areas. Overworld theme is amazing. The song, known as Eternal Wind, really feels whimsical and cheery, as expected from a game where our party consists of adventuring kids. If you want an example of how really good this soundtrack is, however, and how much more different it is, look no further than the battle themes. In the first game, there was only one battle theme that played throughout the game no matter who you were fighting. In 2, there was a boss theme, but it was only for some fights over others, like with the Emperor. But in 3, things have changed. There's the regular battle theme, as expected. Which comes with an awesome backbeat, of course, but then there's the boss theme. Just listen to it. This song is fantastic. For the final game to be on the Famicom from Square, this really does show how far the soundtracks and the games have come from the original. And of course, there's the victory theme, which may be my favorite victory theme on the Famicom just because of one subtle little difference. See if you can spot it. Hear that? That backbeat that plays with the victory theme? That's what makes this one my favorite of the Famicom trilogy. It's just fantastic.